to T Morrow by Paul John Lynn, Part 7. Last time, we left Thomas travelling into the past. The noise was deafening, but all he could think of was, had he thrown the milk away? He knew he'd emptied the fridge. He knew he'd dragged it out to an outbuilding to defrost and drain. Had he switched everything off? Then, all hell broke loose. What Thomas didn't realise, that was a while ago, when his phone signal went dead, it was because a gigantic solar flare was heading to Earth, and it had finally struck. The machine suddenly began rocking and spinning. He tried to correct it by the levers, but instead it was like riding a bucking bronco. His knuckles were white, gripping hard so as not to fall off. The sun's recent ejection had finally reached its full strength here on Earth. It threw the device's systems way off. The sense of nausea increased. Thomas was not well. His head throbbed. His heart began to hurt. He thought he was going to die. Shooting pain stabbed down his arm. A violent headache, blackness, and he was gone. He awoke, and as his eyes focused, he found himself on a rustic bed, with covers decorated with symbols and patterns from the Far East. His head felt cold, and he realised his head had been shaven. He was wearing a white robe. He tried to move, but his muscles ached intensely. He saw a glass of water next to the bed on a crude table. He felt dizzy, reaching for it even. He took a drink. It felt good as the cold water slid down his throat. Then he became aware of a slight tang. He felt immediately dizzy, then blackness flooded over him once more, and he slumped back. Thomas awoke a second time. It was days later. This time, as he focused, he saw the smiling face of a young boy. He too was bald-headed, and wore an orange robe. The boy took his hand, and laughing, helped Thomas to get to a sitting position on the side of the bed. Thomas felt dizzy. Slowly he felt confident enough to stand, and realised he had so much more energy than the last time he awoke. The boy, laughing, pulled him to his feet. Slowly he led him across to the small window. As he walked across the room, he became aware of the wind screeching past the window. It was howling. But what a view! Opposite level with the window in the far distance was the peak of a mountain top, covered in ice and snow. He looked up and saw a misty blue sky. Then the mist covered it, and it was gone. He then looked down, and a vast drop disappeared down into the mist. His guide then led him to the door, and an opening had to hold tight as the wind didn't take it out of his hand. Thomas edged to the door aperture. The wind was howling and blowing in, blowing through his robe. He saw poles with pennants and flags flapping in the wind. In the distance he could see a series of rock-cut steps leading round the cliff edge, and disappeared out of sight behind a huge shard of rock. He looked up, and the cliff above him rose high into the air, which had suddenly materialised. He dared to look down, and felt dizzy, to the amusement of the boy. With the boy's help, he hedged his way along, holding the iron handles to steady himself in the buffeting gale, which roared louder than ever. Once they rounded the rock, the breeze dropped by half, and he could see a flat area, with wooden structures placed on it in the distance. The structures were painted in pinks and green, but had succumbed to the elements and were weather-worn and faded. More poles with flags and pennants flapped, and he saw in the distance two figures enter a building. They ignored him. He was taken to a large structure, which seemed older somehow, and as they entered inside, once their eyes had adjusted to the gloom within and the door closed, he saw a gnarled old man, cross-legged on a huge cushion. his bones clearly visible beneath the thin old flesh. He was chanting in a high-pitched voice, with his eyes closed, his palms pressed together in prayer. He stopped, and his wrinkled features revealed kind eyes that opened, and he smiled. He bowed his head, and the boy spoke. "He brought you back. You died." Thomas looked at the boy, then at the yogi. The yogi replied, "I'm afraid you will have to wait to travel into your next incarnation. For you to live, the gods must be with you. The prophecy was true and must be fulfilled." Thomas said, "You speak English very well." The yogi replied, "You are not the first visitor. We have had several. 2 from the north, from different times. You arrived and your body was broken. It was severed from the mortal coil, your soul in transition. It took all our effort to return your soul to your body, and I see now you are restored to this earthly plane." Thomas said, "I did not know. Thank you. You mean I was dead?" The yogi smiled and nodded a yes. Thomas, "I don't know what to say. How can I repay you?" The yogi said, "All we ask is that you stay for a solar year. We will teach you our methods. You will become a student here. We also ask that you add to our ancient library with knowledge we do not have and experiences we have not experienced." Thomas said, "But I have to rescue my fiancée. I can't stay. I have to leave." Thomas was about to ask about the device, but changed his mind. The yogi said, "It is not a request. It is a fair demand. Surely 1 year is fair trade for your life." The yogi then smiled. "You are a vacant shell. You are a blank page, like the book awaiting your knowledge. It is also quite a drop from here, should you wish to be aided in your desire to die once again." He grinned, and Thomas nodded, acknowledging the deal was a fair one. The yogi closed his eyes, and before Thomas's eyes, the yogi's body seemed to rise. It rose up to 2 inches and hung there in space, then rested slowly back down. He then opened his eyes and smiled once again at Thomas. Thomas could not believe his eyes. Was he hallucinating? Or did he see what he thought he saw? He must be ill. The yogi then said, "You see, you do not know a thing, Englishman, but you will." He was taken out of the temple and back to the cell by the boy, but it wasn't a cell as you would think of as a prisoner would. Or was it? He had agreed to stay for a year. He was a willing intern, it seemed. The boy spoke. "At sunrise we begin." The boy bowed and then left him alone with his thoughts. Was his machine ruined? Was it smashed on a mountainside? How could he ever find Letty now? He felt so sad, but at the same time resigned to his fate, for somehow it felt right just to go along with all of this. Thomas awoke to the blasts of horns that heralded the dawn. He carefully negotiated the treacherous rock-cut steps around the rock to the small village and temple area. The devotees in their orange robes were blowing horns with pennants dangling from them, again painted with the designs and coloured symbols of the sun and the stars. The boy ran to him, took his hand and led him to the largest low structure, and inside at least 20 orange-robed holy men and boys sat in front of a wooden bowl. A figure who looked European was going around the long table, giving each a scoop of rice. Another boy filled up a wooden cup at each place with water. In the centre of the table, one between 4 men, was a plate of bread. Thomas sat, and the men chanted a prayer, in a language he could not identify. Then the yogi began to eat. Only then did everyone else eat. Thomas was so hungry. He had almost finished before the others had barely started. The orange-robed figures began to laugh along with the yogi, and the yogi said, "A dead man needs to eat like a horse, it seems." All the devotees began laughing, and Thomas found soon he was laughing too. It was so good to eat. The boy fetched some more bread. After the meal, the yogi motioned Thomas to come over to him, and he took him outside. Thomas followed, and realised he could not feel the cold, although this realisation made him suddenly feel a chill. Some distance from the cluster of buildings stood an ancient-looking structure, far older, made of huge stout timbers. Where this wood came from? How did they get up here? He thought. How could men manipulate it when it was up here? The almost tree-trunk-sized pieces were even larger as he came closer to them. 2 red-robed figures holding what looked like lances stood to one side as the yogi produced a huge key and opened the massive lock. He touched the door lightly, and it swung open with ease despite its massive scale. As Thomas's eyes adjusted, he saw shelves that reached high, one on top of the other. Each shelf was packed with ancient-looking books that were twice the size one would expect. A rickety ladder stood against one side, and Thomas realised there were many rows filling the entire structure as far as you could see. The yogi climbed and without effort took a tome from the shelf and passed it to Thomas. Thomas crumpled, only just managing not to drop the book, which weighed a significant amount. The yogi laughed as he climbed down. He took Thomas down the length of the building into a rock-cut area to one side, and onwards deeper into a cave area. Tunnels went in many directions from this central open area, lit by the glow of lamps. They weren't flames, but they behaved similar. Thomas placed the book on the table in the centre of this area. The yogi opened it and revealed the first blank page of this book. The yogi said, "It is here that you write who you are, and then record the knowledge from your world that we may not know, your experiences which you have had, which we may not have. When you are done, we will speak again." He smiled and left the cave area, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. He picked up the feather pen and nib. He'd never used one. He dipped it into the inkwell and began to write. It spattered everywhere. He turned to the back of the book just to experiment to get used to writing with it. After a few sentences, he started to get the hang of it. He then went to the front of the book, to the blank page, and began to write. This went on day after day. He was having training, meditation, various other techniques. 2 months later, having repeated this every day and without complaint, stopping only when fetched by the boy for meals and to go to sleep, Thomas said to the boy, "I have done as instructed. Will the yogi see me yet?" The boy said, "He has been reading every night what you have written, and said you would ask to see him today. He said you have not disclosed how you arrived here yet, and will not speak with you until you write this down." Thomas said he would not believe me if I did. The boy said, "He will know what you write is true or false." Thomas said he would miss the meal, and began writing the true story. Time travel, the machine, Theodore's travels, and Letitia, and everything he could think of. What did it matter? No one would read it anyway, stuck up here. The next dawn he was taken by the boy to the temple area and into the wooden structure, and there sat the yogi. The yogi said, "I read your last entry. I thank you for your honesty. Follow me please into the librarium." Thomas followed the yogi, who took a lamp from a sconce to light their way. It cast shadows in all directions. They made their way to a section Thomas had not been to before, more of a cave. The yogi pointed to a book high on a shelf and asked Thomas to get it down. It was a small thin book amongst other small volumes. He carried it down and blew off the dust and placed it on the table. The yogi said, "This may be of interest. It has waited for you for quite a time." Thomas opened the clasps and carefully opened the book to the title page. It was handwritten. In clear copperplate writing, it said, "This is the journal of Dr. Theodore Morrow." Thomas said, "My God, so this is where it is." The yogi said, "Yes, as I said, we have had visitors before. I met your ancestor many, many years ago." Thomas said, "That's not possible. You would have to be very, very old." The yogi smiled. "I have seen centuries as you have seen years. It is yours to read now, and you can make notes, but we must keep it here." The yogi bowed and left Thomas. Thomas sat down and now began to read the journal, making notes as he went along. When he finally got to the end where the last entry appeared interrupted and made little sense, he closed the journal. The following morning he asked to see the yogi. Now he had finished reading and taking the notes from the journal, he wondered what was next. The boy took him to the yogi again. The yogi said, "You have been an exemplary student. Still have not dared to ask me the question which has burned on your lips since you arrived here. You have not looked at any of the other books other than those I instructed you to. Follow me." The yogi took a lamp from the wall and entered one of the passages with a dead end. The yogi waved his hand and the rock disappeared, revealing a curtain. He then motioned Thomas to pull aside the curtain, and there stood the device. The yogi said, "I believe we have something of yours." This device found its way home to where it was created. It is not from the future, but from a former civilization of the Hyperborean age, way back in the depths of time. We had chosen to confiscate it and store it here, along with all the other fantastic objects, devices and knowledge from a former time. But it doesn't look like it's damaged. What went wrong? The yogi replied, "The sun cast out a beam. You call it a solar flare. And it played havoc with the device, so it returned home." On the seat sat the proximity device. Thomas said, "What convinced you to let me have it back?" The yogi said, "We have a prophecy that a dead man would arrive with a mysterious device. He will return to life, and we will look and we will find evidence of the device in the oldest of our books," which we did. Your ancestor knew you would arrive here one way or another at some time. You have now read his journal, well, at least the one that ends abruptly. You are now one of us, you are an adept. It is, however, your choice. There is a rather long drop from up here, you may recall me saying. He chuckled, and Thomas smiled. The yogi said, "There is one task I must ask you to fulfill. That is, if you can spare me some of your valuable time. This task, once completed, will mean you can leave us earlier than your full solar year." Thomas said, "Yes, I was so afraid the device was lost. No problem. What is this task?" "The task we ask you to do is that we have discovered that an expedition is on its way to look for our old shy friend. He is the last of his species. His ancestors were simple creatures whose immense strength helped us to bring up the trees and materials to create our temple complex. They did this in exchange for food, which is rather scarce around here, as you can imagine. Think of him as you would a whale or an elephant who lives a life without any consciousness and shares our world. We fear the expedition is hoping to either capture him or kill him and return him to their country as a specimen or a curiosity. We cannot allow this. You will claim to have seen him and join their expedition, and ensure by any means you wish to use to make sure he is not caught. Some of the young men will act as guides and will help when required." Thomas said, "What kind of creature is he exactly?" The yogi said, "Well, you may know him as an abominable, but we know him as a yeti." Thomas said, "For real? You mean he exists?" The yogi said, "He does have distant related species in the places all over the world, especially in America." Thomas said, "Wow, what an adventure! I swear I will do my best."
Passing through a day tonight where I see peaks and soon in sight we seek to see what's hidden there. Creatures so wide in its snowy lair. Tibetan bells ring round the hills to warn of ill omens unfulfilled. The time stands still, but the the ice moves ever downwards to the sea.
The day came when he was to leave. He would miss the old yogi and the boy. They had returned his clothes to him, and they felt wrong on him now, and he felt too warm. He and 4 strong young men climbed vertically down the cliffside, holding the iron hoops and then standing on the same hoops to lower themselves. They slowly descended to a flat area below. Baggage was lowered down to this area on ropes. Here, a crude pulley system, a rope and basket affair, used rocks from down at the cliff base to counterlever the weight of one person at a time. Thomas gingerly climbed into the basket. He looked over the edge of it, but all he could see was mist. But he wasn't afraid of the height. Over the months he had become accustomed to its heights, traversing past the cliff every day. From the bottom of the cliff it was a hazardous further route through the rest of the mountainside. Eventually, hours later, they dropped below the mist, and grass and ferns and flowers clung onto the rocks as best they could. Soon they were in a fertile valley and heading northeast. The 4 students carried 2 large tents and basic cooking equipment, and as darkness fell they made camp for the night. Although the rock bed was hard, Thomas didn't feel uncomfortable. He realised he was quite fit. He soon slept, and then he was awakened by one of the men taking down the tent. A small village in the distance appeared after the morning's trek. It was here that the expedition had set up camp. Thomas instructed 2 of the guides to stay here in the mountains out of sight, and only come if needed. After the guides had taken down the camp, Thomas and 2 of the guides headed to the buildings in the far distance. It was here that the expedition had set up camp. A man stood in front of one of the buildings, smoking a pipe. Thomas said, "Good afternoon, I am Dr. Thomas Morrow. I heard you wished to find guides to help you track the abominable snowman." Cole shouted in a German accent, "Smythe, there's some men out here who want to help us apparently." Smythe shouted, "Bring them in, make sure they aren't armed," replied Smythe. Thomas entered the doorway, having been frisked by the man. Inside there were 2 men wearing hunting clothes, not too well suited to the task in hand in this environment, Thomas thought. Smythe said, "Hope you don't mind, old chap. Only one can never be too careful in these foreign places. You look English, so who are you?" Thomas said, "I am like yourself, interested in helping you locate the creature. That is for a small fee. I was born here, the son of a missionary. I have seen the creature, and its lair. Smythe said, "Let me introduce my colleagues. Mr. Carl Wambach from Germany, and Mr. Westwood from America. Friends, call me Smythe. My friends are both accomplished hunters. Why do you think we need you?" Thomas said, "Well, it's up to you. How long can you spend looking? I can probably find the creature in a quarter of the time." Westwood looked at Smythe and Carl, and then said, "I have used native hunters to help me, but a limey Tibetan? I'm not convinced." Thomas said, "If you look outside, you will see my 2 local guides, who are used to these conditions and know the mountains well, especially the weather conditions and dangerous areas." Carl stood up and walked to the door and looked out to look at the 2 men. "Don't they feel the cold? They are only wearing thin robes." He shuddered and returned, closing the door quickly behind him, then stood rubbing his hands by the small stove, followed by blowing into his cupped hands. Smythe walked to Thomas and shook his hand with a firm grip, while staring intently with his hard black eyes. Smythe said, "I think, gentlemen, we can proceed much faster with our new friend's help. Exactly what is your fee?" Thomas replied, 100 English pounds. Carl said, "I'm not paying any part of that amount." Mr. Westwood said, "But Carl, here he is. He has guides. I don't want to be in this god-forsaken place for eternity. I say we pay the man and get on with the business in hand." Smythe then said to Carl, "As joint partners, you are outvoted. Or do you want to renegotiate our other terms at a lower percentage?" Carl said, "Okay, fine, you win. When do we leave?" Thomas said, "Okay. I will go and ask my guys to negotiate some supplies and see how far we can use animals." He left, closing the door behind him firmly as an icy wisp of wind and snow bit at his neck. He felt cool, but he didn't feel freezing. Even so, he adjusted his collar, woolen muffler and knitted balaclava. He was out of earshot, but guessed what the conversation may be back inside, and he wasn't wrong. Mr. Westwood, "Carl, no need to worry, we won't be paying anyone. It is a difficult journey, and not difficult to lose a man up there." Smythe said, "I want no part in murder. I'll pay him if it comes to that. He is an Englishman, like me, and a gentleman." Carl thought to himself, "I had planned on Westwood having an accident. Now I have 3 to dispose of somehow." There was a break in the weather, and the party now had dogs and sleds, much to the hunting partnership's annoyance, as they had to pay for them up front. It cost them 2 silver fob watches, some gold, and a gold wedding ring from the party. Alexander Kellis had recently climbed in the Himalayas the previous year, and had brought with him the dogs which the locals had kept for any future adventurers. It was a new business. Climbers had appeared from all over the world over the months. Kellis had spoken to a group where Smythe had been present. Back in London, Smythe had attended his lecture, as he was planning an expedition to track down the abominable snowman. Smythe was no fool, and was well off, having just become heir to the Colburn estate. He planned to bring back the creature alive and put it on show and make a name for himself and his partners. His partners secretly had other plans, however. The party left early, just before sunrise, so to have plenty of time before darkness forced them to camp. Although not a mountain climbing expedition, some climbing would be necessary. They were soon negotiating the most accessible direct routes. Westwood had climbed before, and Carl had done a little in warmer climates there. Thomas had never climbed, but after living with the yogi, he had sort of developed a way of coping. Didn't fear heights at all. He was now the fittest he'd been in years, lean and strong. He knew he was up to the task.